Hey everybody, this is Alzorath, and welcome to Friday Night Hex. Today we're going to take a look at the hot color of the week, and that is, ironically, a fairly cold color at that, and that is Sapphire, or blue. With the recent spoiling of 2 cards in the School of Magic, the discussion and speculation is running rampant, so that definitely made choosing 2 of the 5 cards for this week rather easy to do, since, right off the bat, I kind of have to talk about the lovely Talk of the Day cards that were just recently revealed. But I also want to look at 3 other Sapphire cards that interest me as well. Now, before I jump into the cards, I have to say there are other cards that would have made this episode, but this release of information made those cards kind of less relevant, and they will be seen in a future episode without a doubt, because I do want to cover them. There are more Sapphire cards that really interest me, so no need to worry, they will be gotten to. I just find 5 cards to be kind of the sweet spot in terms of the length of the episodes, because about then we're reaching the 20-30 minute mark and it is a little bit overbearing. Now that aside, let's go ahead and look at the first of our hot topic cards, and that is Counter Magic. Counter Magic is pretty much what you'd expect from the name. It's a counter spell with a bit of a twist, and if you read its stats, it's basically a common card that's 3 resource with 2 Sapphire threshold. That looks very familiar to you people who play Magic the Gathering. It's a quick action. Of course, it's a counterspell. It's got to be a quick action. And it says, interrupt target card. Each card in an opposing zone with the same name as that card gets permanent cost +2. Now notice it says opposing zone. That means all enemies, not just one. So if there's ever a 2-headed giant or a kingdom format, you can bet it's going to be kind of disadvantageous to run multiple decks of the same type. Now, truthfully, as far as we're concerned, the first part of this is a moot point. It's a 3-cost counterspell. It's fairly basic and straightforward, and pretty much it's what was expected from the first true counterspell that we get revealed in Hex. Now, I know there are other counter functions that were shown before this, but most of them are conditional or limited in some form or fashion. This one's not complicated. No special conditions, no big bag. It's just a big bag of nope, to put it quite simply. The really interesting part, if you look at it, is actually the side effect, or the second part of the phrasing, and it's the part that reads, each card in opposing zone with the same name as that card gets permanent +2 to cost. Simply put, it is quite literally a deaccelerator. If they have a fast card and you counter it, you make that card a lot slower. If they have a big beefy thing, you make it even more expensive. Now, this kind of card is, oddly enough, rather uncommon in TCGs simply because implementation is a little bit eh. In other TCGs, you often see things such as an outright, you can't use X, or you can't control more than X of Y, as opposed to these slowing effects, which you see in a few games. Don't get me wrong, they are present, they're around, but you only see a limited amount of cards that say things such as X costs Y more, such as creatures costs a little bit more to summon. That's probably the most common one. Or cards that specifically limit a specific other card. This actually kind of makes me hope to see Cryptozoic really introduce more cards that slow rather than outright stop effects, such as delaying turns, making things cost more. Heck, I can see an Omen of Oblivion that attaches to a card and makes it cost more just straight up. Or that when drawn destroys all other copies of that card. Things like that would be rather interesting to see. Something that slows rather than just straight up limits, if you get what I'm getting at. But before I dive into like the personal card suggestions, I should probably move on. Now, as far as this card's potency in draft, it'll be okay. It's a counterspell. It's your run-of-the-mill 3-cost counterspell, quite literally. It's very limited impact on the decks due to a lack of multiple copies of many cards outside of commons. But in constructed, though, it will be much stronger, as you can see, because control decks are obviously a lot more present in constructed. And it can take advantage of the 3 of, 4 of deck construction methods. Now, either way, though, definitely it's a card that you want to collect at least 4 of, and you want to look at it in a draft if you want to have some counters. It's kind of a cornerstone card that you'll see around a lot, as counterspells should be, a basic counterspell at least. Now, some people have been speculating that cards like this are intended to deter play of the 4 ofs, and potentially even the 3 ofs. Honestly, I don't think that's quite what they're going for with it. And if they were, they're not exactly doing an exceptional job at it with the other cards. I mean, sure, there's cards that may indicate it or counterbalance the effect of shifting towards 2 or less, such as multiplier cards and stuff like that. But these cards aren't really the rule, but rather the exception. They're there, but they're not the majority of the cards. The majority of the cards are rather standard. It feels rather to me that they would want to just give the option of shifting to the quote-unquote singleton style deck and moving it into standard play. And obviously you're not going to have a true singleton because it's not going to be super efficient. I can see some scatterbrain decks, though, being semi-playable, though. Now, truth be told, the real use of it is probably going to reach more towards almost kind of an awkward teching method, which you have the core of your deck being the 4 ofs, which are just going to run through. But instead of going with 3 ofs for the support of those and 2 ofs for the techs, you're going to go with a lot of 2 of supports that kind of work towards your goal rather than just 4-3-2 being the standard. Now, some of you may not agree with the 4-3-2 standard. I personally like it. It makes sense to me. It's an easy way of starting a deck before you start fine-tuning it. That's just how I look at it. Now, with the topic ending up going with what is Hex going for with a different type of deck composition, that's a very different discussion than what I'd like to have. In this particular episode, I'll probably have it later on, so I'm going to leave it at that. And I think they're likely going to introduce more archetypes of decks, really, with the way the game is shaping up. But I digress. So let's go ahead and jump into the next recently spoiled card, and that is the Polymorph Dingler. I was debating whether I felt awkward saying Dingler, and indeed, I do. Polymorph Dingler is 5 resources, 2 Sapphire threshold, so it's kind of expensive. It's an uncommon quick action, and it's a very simple card that says target troop transforms into a Dingler, with Dingler being a 0-1 troop. It's got its own race called a Dingler troop, which makes it sound like it's hanging off of someone's butt. But this spell in and of itself is pretty much a second-rate pacifism or inner conflict that has the advantage of removing the unit's natural abilities. So it does have that kind of extra side to it. Personally, I can't say I particularly like this spell simply because of how expensive it is. I'd rather go with Diamond Sapphire Hybrid and have the cheap effect that's just as effective against all but the ability-driven creatures than to use such an expensive, just pure Sapphire spell. Now, there are uses for using it against like the big guys and using it to limit abilities. But I do kind of hope that they look at the Dingler and approach it as something more of a combo effect that uses these polymorphed Dinglers to your advantage. A simple thought would be explode Dingler or something like that. Just something simple. Just something that makes the Dingler useful after you've transformed it into it. Makes it useful for the caster of Polymorph Dingler, of course. Now, it's just a mediocre card in my opinion, but the interest I have in it isn't really the card itself, but more how it's phrased. It says Polymorph : creature name. Dingler in this case. This leads me to believe that there will be more polymorph cards, which could very easily, I mean very, very easily lead to some interesting trap effects and combat effects. I mean, you could be attacking with a little 1/1 and have a polymorph card in your hand. Maybe that polymorph card makes the creature into like a kamikaze creature that blows up on death and deals a whole bunch of damage or kills the other creature. Or maybe it just transforms it into a big stompy kind of mammoth creature, or even just turn it into a creature that deals damage to its owner each time it's tapped. That would be another good aggressive use of polymorph. Or even have it deal damage on each upkeep. I don't know. It would just make some interesting shifts in strategy, especially mid-game, which allows you to kind of transform your deck into something that it's not if you really want. So it would be kind of a good tech not really a tech in, a sideboard, if you will, for some decks. It would be a good strategy for weenie decks that generate a lot of cheap cards. Such as, Shinhair decks come to mind right away, or Raptor decks. These could transform all these token creatures or farmed creatures into basically a lot bigger and a lot more dangerous things if this is actually something that is a deal. Now, I don't know if they're going to do that. This is the first polymorph card we've seen, so there's no telling. But that aside, let's move on to another cheap guy, and I think you guys can see this one coming from a mile away. It's the first not recently spoiled card. In fact, it's been spoiled for a while, and it's seen a lot in draft talks, and you've seen it even in mine. It's the Thunderbird. It's been talked about to death, probably, and it's easily one of my favorite draft picks, as I have said in previous conversations. I mean, it's a 2-resource, 2 Sapphire Threshold, 1/1 Bird Spirit that has Flight and Rage 1. For those of you who still don't know, Rage 1 basically gives you an extra attack point each time this creature attacks. Again, most of you know this card from my previous video, or the plethora of other videos on it, or even practice drafts that people have held before. And I greatly enjoy this creature's power in that respect. It's an evasive, quick-growing, cheap turn 2 drop. You can't ask for much more in a draft. That is a great draft pick, period. Now, while it is very powerful in draft, it's a little bit less so in constructed, especially if you think about how the cards might evolve. You're more likely to run into good answers to this card, first of all, in constructed, as creatures are sort of like a duh. We have to deal with this kind of situation. But that said, they're not exactly a weak choice either. They are a turn 2 flying drop that grows. That's nothing to scoff at. And you do have a variety of options to make them more stable, especially if you go dual or triple color. And I do think we'll end up, but the thing is, I do think we'll end up seeing bigger 2-drop flyers and probably some decent 1-drop flyers as well that can answer this particular creature. I don't know if they'll be common, uncommon, or what, but you can kind of expect it. Now, that will make this kind of more of a situational, or possibly, if it's still good enough, a run-of-the-mill kind of just, I need a flyer in the 2 spot, put in Thunderbird. Although I see it being more likely in specific builds. Now, as I've already given the opinion of this creature in draft in another video, and I love it for that, I have to say in constructed, I definitely see it being less useful, especially since combos and variety are much greater in a healthy constructed format. It is common though, so can't really dismiss it too much or hate it at all. So I see it popping up in constructed, just not as frequent as in draft. Now, moving on, we kind of have to know that this next one is coming, especially since I covered Omen of Oblivion in the previous video, and I sort of hinted at this card before. And that is Sabotage. It's a rare, 3-resource, 2 Sapphire Threshold. It's a basic action. You have to do it on your turn. That's alright. But its effect is it creates 4 booby traps and shuffles them into target opposing champion's deck. Now what booby traps do is they deal 5 damage whenever they're drawn. This makes it a very nasty card because you're putting basically a play set of these damaging cards into the enemy player's deck. If you have 4 of these, you can put 16 of them in their deck. That makes drawing quite painful and risky. Now, you're not going to draw all 4 of these in a match. It's going to be so rare that you actually see that, but 1 or 2 even can do some decent effects. And truth be told, I can see people coming up with some weird kind of deck decay builds with this, especially in the Blood Sapphire combo. And this really isn't possible to see in a traditional paper-based TCG because, well, you'd be able to see the cards and there'd be some giveaway and all this other stuff. And just some of the effects are just infeasible in a trading card game that's physical. In functionality, though, I don't see it being overpowered or anything. I see, if this is actually able to become a thing, I see it filling a similar role to possibly the discard decks and a little bit into the realm of mill decks. Now, for those of you that remember Megrim a few years back in Magic, I see it filling a similar role to that or some of the heavier mill decks that we've seen throughout the years. Simply put, it's interesting to play, but only marginally useful in some of the competitive scenes, as there's usually a lot of answers to this, whether they be soft answers or hard answers. Now, unlike Megrim decks and mill decks, which rely heavily on removing the enemy's deck, hand, etc., which, like I said, can be soft countered by a variety of tactics and hard countered by others, this tactic actually serves to dilute the enemy deck, making drawing much more likely to result in dead draws, painful draws, and the only real answer to it being tutor-like effects, or just enduring through it. And I can see strategies actually forming eventually that turn decks into like a mush with bombs and voided cards and all manners of draw if you dare type effects, really hurting decks that focus on digging heavily into themselves, for example. That really helps against accelerating decks. And honestly, if you think about it, this kind of effect on a deck would kill things like Sphinx Revelations. It would be the perfect counter to these accelerant decks, which are just ramp up decks for those of you who are using proper terminology, which I never do. I'm horrible about that. I just look at the strategy and give it whatever name seems to fit, because I am a RPG player primarily, not a TCG player from the past. Although I have done TCGs a whole lot. I digress. Now, Booby Trap, back on subject magically, also has the nice effect of, in addition to the damage, it is still a dead draw. It kills the tempo of the opponent by giving them just an obvious, oh, you got damaged. You got nothing else. Yay. And I really wouldn't be surprised if decks that rely on this take on a naming scheme that follows this, like Trappy, Slush, or Dead Draw kind of nature in their design and naming. Now, as far as where it's useful, in drafting, it's interesting. I'm going to just say it's interesting. You're only going to get maybe one of these in a draft, and it would possibly be worth picking up because you're putting those 4 booby traps into a deck of 40 cards instead of 60. That's meaning it's a little bit more dilution and a little bit more likely for them to draw at least one. That 5 damage can be deadly. It could surprisingly turn a winning turn into a losing turn for some people, especially if the match is particularly close. And this increased chance means it's decent in draft. It's not great, but I would consider it about on par with Thunderbird personally, because this is kind of a situation where if you had a Thunderbird and a Sabotage in one pack, it'd be kind of a torn choice for me. Yes, Thunderbird is more reliable. It's an early drop. It's a creature. It's a guy. It's a flyer. It's all these things that are exceptionally great, and Sabotage is a little bit unreliable. But if you see the Sabotage, you're only likely to get a chance at that once. And that's the only reason why I would ever choose it over Thunderbird. That Sabotage could be a nice little trick to throw in there, and it's cheap enough that you can actually rationalize putting it in the deck as a trick. Now, some people might disagree with me there. I like it. That's just how I am. I like trick cards. I like playing around with decks. I like blue. I like black as well, so you'll often see me draft black-blue back whenever I used to do that many years ago, and I plan to do again in the future. Now, I think this card actually starts to shine, though, whenever you move into the constructed realm, simply because you can have 4 of it. And it can play into that style of flood the deck with dead draws and traps mentality. And while I highly doubt we've seen the full effects of this, I've also highly doubt that we've seen the entire list of cards that can do this. I just enjoy the idea of slagging the hell out of an enemy deck so that it will look more like Swiss cheese. And right now it's not viable. It's not a viable strategy, but it's something I like to fantasize about. I'm going to say that right up front. This putting holes in an enemy's deck is more of like an alternate tool and a trick rather than a game-winning strategy. I'm going to say that right now. The cards just aren't there to make it viable yet. We also haven't had all the cards spoiled. bling. I gave a cheesy smile right then, so I had to like note it with some kind of word. There definitely needs to be more cards towards this goal to make it a possible win condition. And I really have to wonder what kind of decks people will play with this kind of card if there aren't enough viable cards for it. Will they include it as a sort of secondary goal, or will they include it as a sort of trap to slow the enemy down? Throw it in a control deck maybe, kind of like as an accessory. But still, the thought that engages me the most with these is just how much of a Swiss cheese I can make the enemy deck. How nasty and cruddy and filled with dead draws and damage I can do it. But anyway, contemplation aside, fantasizing about turning things into Swiss cheese, because cheese is awesome, we have to move on to number 5 before I run out of time, because we've already passed the 20-minute mark here. Right about now. And that is saved for, you probably guessed it, because I haven't included any real old creatures besides the Thunderbird. I kind of wanted to include 2 creatures in my random picks. And that's going to be the Kraken. There is another creature that interested me, but I will save him for later. But the Kraken is a legendary 8 resource, 3 Sapphire threshold Kraken troop. Yes, it's got its own troop type. It's an 8/8, and it's got the ability of 3 resources to create a Kraken's tentacle and put it into play. Now, you can also exhaust any number of tentacles you control. Note, it does not exhaust the Kraken itself, just the tentacles, and you can gain control of target troop with costs less than the number of tentacles exhausted this way. Now, if that wasn't just kind of creepy and nasty enough, Kraken's tentacles are actually 1/1 troops of the obvious type tentacle, and if you exhaust a tentacle, you can exhaust target troop. It's an action effect, and the reason why I find this card interesting is not only is it a big nasty beast, I mean, it's an 8/8, it's a tank, but it basically provides a tool for controlling a wide array of even nastier beasts. Most of the other big nasty bombs work simply by either making your deck more aggressive or in some way neutralizing in an indirect way or another the enemy creatures. This one simply brings up a visual much like the old movies and games where you have the big central Kraken and his monster tentacles doing most of the work neutralizing the opponents. Notice the neutralizing. You have to consider also, in addition to this, the turn you cast this, you're going to have 8 resources. That means that each turn after, chances are you'll be able to produce 2, if not 3 tentacles per turn, easily shutting down an army. I mean, 3 1/1s, not impressive late game as far as offense goes, but they're the fact that they can shut down any enemy creature. It doesn't give any conditions. They don't have to be on the ground. They don't have to be a certain strength. This 1/1 can shut down anything. It exhausts it. It can't use its abilities even. Meaning that is a good reaction effect as well. And once you get enough of the tentacles, you can even steal bombs yourself. Now, this all said, I don't think Kraken is necessarily overpowered. It is a bomb. No question about it. And though a part of me wants to say, maybe make it so the tentacles can only exhaust non-flying troops, because as it stands, the tentacles can shut down even other bombs that are flying. Although, considering how late in the game this shows, it's pretty much the only type of true shutdown this creature would face would be another bomb, outside of maybe murder or extinction, or like we said earlier, polymorph dingler. And in reality, it's cards like this that guarantee you pretty much will need at least a minimal amount of removal in your control in your deck. All that said, though, I have to think, what is this worth in draft and constructed? Draft, its cost is way too high. I'm going to say that right up front. Even in constructed, its cost is extremely high, but at least then you have accelerants. But it may be worth grabbing for a pinch use as possibly a late game card in draft, or even as a money card to sell on the market. But where a card like this tends to shine is in the accelerated constructed, where you can accelerate your resources or control the match into late game to allow for this type of creature to come into play. While I don't see this being like a 4 of in anybody's deck simply due to its immense cost, I'm not even sure if you can include 4 of legendaries. I forget the mechanics of legendaries in Hex. Wow, I am flaking out on that. My notes here say that I could see packing 2 of these into a deck as reasonable. Yes, I have notes. I don't really have it verbatim, but I have notes in front of me so I don't miss too much. I will miss some, though. I can see 2 of them in a deck and kind of just waiting for them because you're going to need them late game. You're going to be going through about half, if not more, of your deck before you get to a point where you can safely play something like this. So, yeah, you'll probably draw it by then. But it would basically make dealing with any late game creature deck a lot easier to have this. It quite literally shuts them down and steals all their big stuff. Now, you won't see it as often as you think. It's a legendary card, first of all. It's going to be rare as all get out. And it is more of a I like big stompy things card that actually has some practical purposes in certain decks. I see it being played in mono blue, possibly blue black, occasionally blue white, but I don't see it going too much more beyond that. I don't see it going into like the blue red or blue green hybrids, which will focus more on either control and burn or control and swarm respectively. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and leave that alone. There's probably a lot of things a lot of other people could say about the Kraken. Some may like it more, some may like it less. I don't particularly love the Kraken. I just think it's a very interesting bomb because it is a control bomb as opposed to a just big stompy nasty I'm going to kill you bomb. Although it can do that too with its control. But yeah, those are just some rough thoughts on the various cards. I have notes, but I probably missed some points, as I always do, because I write this up pretty much the day I record it. I write a list of notes on the 5 cards that I want to cover, and then I just read through them and kind of formulate thoughts around my little bullet points. But anyways, I hope you guys all enjoyed this quick rundown, and be sure to remember to suggest cards that you would like to see reviewed, and I'll definitely include them in the running for the future episodes of Friday Night Hex as sort of a cards of the week feature that I'll be doing at the end. They'll probably come into play when I switch to doing more topical videos, as like bread, for example, or deck building videos. And that's kind of a little backlog of information that I want to build up. Now, anyways, I'm going to go ahead and go. I'm sitting here at 20 some odd minutes, almost 30 probably. So I'm going to let you guys go. I'm going to say, if you all enjoyed this, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Spread the word of Hex. Even if it's not my channel, spread other channels' information about Hex. Spread the word about the game. Get hype going on it. Hype. And get people looking at it, because I have a feeling this is going to be the better, cheaper alternative to Magic the Gathering Online. I see it being complicated enough to keep people engaged, and as long as Cryptozoic plays their cards right, it's going to be very, very nice. As an aside, Cryptozoic, this is a plea. Please make a good auction house. I am begging you. For goodness sake, good auction house. Good auction house. Don't kill the game for me with some kind of trade chat or some kind of stupid, bizarre thing that I have to deal with walls of WTBs, WTSs, and WTTs. Or bots trading. Oh my god. Just do that right. But anyway, keep gaming. Peace out. This has been Alzorath. Sorry for the tirade at the end of there. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.